Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this ExpressRoute webinar delivered by Core Azure and Equinix. Good to see so many people on the call this morning. We had about, I think, 42 people or so sign up and register their interest for the webinar itself, which I guess highlights the increasing significance of cloud connectivity, but also the interest that's been shown generally in the ExpressRoute product. So before we get going, just a few intros from our side. So on the call today, we have Aram Siddiqui, who's the Network Practice Lead at Core Azure. Then we have Mohammed Ashraf, who is the Partnership Development Manager at Equinix. And shortly, Mohammed is going to give you a short introduction to Equinix. Charlie LaForest is in charge of kind of overseeing proceedings this morning, and myself, who is the Commercial and Consultancy Director at Core Azure. So, very quick intro to Core Azure and Equinix. So, from Core Azure's perspective, clues in the name, Azure is what we do. The company was formed around about 4 years ago with a focus on becoming the UK's leading Azure specialist with a range of services and practices that support hybrid cloud delivery models. We're a Microsoft Gold partner for platforms and have formal partnering arrangements in place with both Equinix and Microsoft for cloud delivery engagements covering both public and private sectors. We focus on enterprise-wide transitions to the clouds, including both infrastructure and platform as a service. Rarely do we lift and shift infrastructure, and instead we tend to focus a little bit more on optimization, cost and risk reduction programs, and service improvements through utilizing the Azure platform capabilities. So that's summing up Core Azure's capabilities. I'll transfer you over now to Mo to introduce himself and Equinix.
Thank you, Tony. So Equinix is in partnership with Core Azure. Core Azure became a partner just over a year ago. And why did they choose to partner with Equinix? It's really about that cloud connectivity piece. Equinix is a global data center provider and houses many of the public cloud service providers, but it also houses multitudes of carriers, which means doesn't matter which carrier you are with, they are in our building and you can then connect to those public cloud service providers very quickly and very efficiently, thereby giving you what we call private connectivity to the public cloud. With that comes a whole host of reliability statistics that I could go on all day about, but I don't want to hold up the main presentation. So at this point, I'll hand over to Aram, who's going to talk you through a great solution.
Thank you, Mo. Good morning, everyone. So thank you all for making the effort and attending this session. As Mo said, I am Aram Siddiqui. I'm working in the network department in Core Azure and working closely with Equinix on our ExpressRoute offering. I've been at Core Azure for almost 2 years, and my main role includes liaising with clients to architect and re-architect their existing network and also perform cloud readiness assessment. So in today's webinar, I want to take you through the benefits and values added by ExpressRoute and how you can implement this. The format of the webinar itself is to start off by discussing the main challenges enterprises face when they migrate to Azure. Then move on to how ExpressRoute helps to address those issues, and then finally, for those of you keen to know about next steps, is what we offer and the workshop after this session. So without further ado, let's start. So one of the key things I need to discuss before we move on, and probably a prerequisite, is you need to be either an Azure existing Azure customer or have some sort of plan to have tenancy in Azure in the future. This is simply because how we can utilize ExpressRoute, and we need to sort of be a Microsoft Cloud customer. So you can also benefit from this, obviously, if you're Office 365 users in some cases. So we'll discuss those as we go through the webinar. So with that being discussed, let's look at a typical scenario and what most of our customers do as a starting point. Most people start off with the VPN, as if thought is the quickest way of getting up and running. Whilst in my view there is some truth in that assumption, it's not always the case, due to further rework required when you actually try and switch to ExpressRoute. And I will come back to that toward end of the presentation after we've looked at all the sort of challenges and how ExpressRoute can address those. So with that in mind, let's look at a couple of the challenges. So obviously security is one thing to consider here. You are using a public internet, so even though you have security in place and end-to-end encryption, the data is still traveling through a public network, and that's not acceptable to some enterprises. Another thing to consider is your performance. So whilst you're traveling over the internet, there is no SLA. There's far many two hoppers between you and Microsoft using internet for there to be any sort of valid SLA in place. What that means is essentially you could, in our experience, you could one day get a 20 millisecond latency and the next day it can be 200 millisecond, which can quite negatively impact your application, especially if you have something like VoIP or have any sort of SQL commands or anything running over that circuit itself. Another thing to consider, and potentially a challenge for some big enterprises, is the speed. So you're limited to 1 gig, and if you need to go anything above that, then you need to start considering ExpressRoute. Scalability is something else also to discuss, and I think is one of the key ones. If you have multiple data centers or multiple sites, the complexity increases quite significantly by starting to having connections from all over the place. With VPN, it can get quite messy and very complicated to set up. So with all those being discussed, let's look at what Microsoft offers. So ExpressRoute is a solution that Microsoft have come up with. It isn't, particularly speaking, a new solution. It's something that's been around for quite some time, but it hasn't been promoted as widely. You could see it essentially as a private dedicated network, which is an extension of your network. Or you could also maybe imagine it as if there's a cable directly plugged in from your enterprise all the way to Microsoft. Essentially, going back to the point saying is an extension, a layer 2 extension of your network. What's more about ExpressRoute is more than a circuit. So whereas with VPN you can only transfer your private data to your IaaS infrastructure, with ExpressRoute you can also have other type of connections. So you can connect to Microsoft public solution offerings, taking a shortcut going over your ExpressRoute, and that's known as public peering. So I suppose with that discussed, you may be interested to know about the peerings. So peering is the term Microsoft uses to refer to the logical connection that's formed over the physical connection itself. You have multiple of those. They are known as private, public, and Office 365. So private is obviously the data that's traveling from your side to Microsoft, to your IaaS infrastructure, so anything you set up in there. Public is to reach public services Microsoft offers, such as SQL storage, and Office 365 is pretty much self-explanatory. So essentially, rather than going over the internet, you're going over the ExpressRoute. You have a dedicated circuit set up for that. So with this sort of brief overview of ExpressRoute, let's have a look at some of its key benefits. Privacy, I think, is one of those things you need to sort of cover. So with this, your data travels over a dedicated network set aside for yourself, end to end. So, and obviously with GDPR coming in May, that's something you may want to consider depending on the nature of your business. Another thing to consider here is the SLA. So whereas with VPN, there isn't really a valid SLA in place, with this you have a SLA in place end to end from Microsoft and from your telco provider, and as we come up to later, potentially from Equinix if you decide to go with us. And one thing I need to cover is also SLA is quite key. In order for your ExpressRoute to be valid, you need to have two logical connections. So what that means is, and I think it's important to cover that, is because the majority of our customers do get confused. It means you need to have two logical connections to Microsoft over a circuit. So that means you could essentially have one physical circuit that's connecting you, but as long as your provider can provide two diverse paths, then Microsoft will honor the SLA. Obviously, we don't recommend you have one physical connection. We do recommend you have multiple for redundancy purposes, but it's something that I think does confuse most people. So essentially, they're referring to the logical connections. So with that discussed, another key advantage is low latency. Probably I would have to say low and predictable latency. So you get a consistent latency. If there's an issue, then obviously you can escalate that, and then there's an SLA in place to address that quickly. Speed is another key one to consider here. So whereas before you could only go up to 1 gig, with this you can go all the way up to 10 gigs. So let's say you start off with a gig, and in a few weeks' time you need to increase that because of the sort of nature of data, or you have a requirement simply for higher throughput. So what you'd be pleased to know is Microsoft offers dynamic scaling of that speed. So you could go and click and say, I want to have, I don't know, 2 gigs now, and they, on best effort basis, they will try and increase you to 2 gigs without causing any downtime. And I think that's probably a key, and then probably easier for yourself to start off with a slower speed and increase as you need to. So with these being discussed, I think another key things we need to also discuss is Microsoft ExpressRoute is global. What that means is essentially when you connect to one of their data centers, so let's say you connect to North Europe, they also offer you connectivity to all of their other data centers within that geopolitical region. So for example, that would include UK West, UK South, and West Europe. So essentially you get a cross connectivity, and if you have any sort of business continuity plan, any sort of infrastructure in place that's replicated across 2 data centers, then you don't need to have multiple ExpressRoute. One link is enough. And another thing to consider, obviously, is it's quite beneficial to have data centers closer to your users for better user experience and obviously an optimized latency. If you want to take that a step further, then you can get the premium add-on as well as add in many features. One of the key ones I want to discuss here is it gives you global connectivity. So if you take on the premium add-on, you pretty much get connectivity to all the dots you see on this page and pretty much all of the Microsoft data centers. When to consider ExpressRoute, it's when, as we've discussed, you need a predictable performance. So you want to have a predictable latency, something that you can rely on a daily basis. If you obviously need an SLA, it's another thing. So you'd be easy to know that there's a strong SLA in place, both by your telco provider and also Microsoft. So in essence, if there's any issues, you have someone to contact. Bandwidth. So once you sort of sign up for a certain speed, you know that's been set aside for yourself, and it's there. There is no reliance on a sort of unreliable internet. Another thing to consider is quality of service. So this is a key for some of the applications, and sometimes both latency and jitter can significantly impact that application to the point that the data may be unusable. So one thing you need to know is with ExpressRoute, Microsoft does offer quality of service. An example of that is Skype. Another thing to consider if you need a managed service. So I think this is best if I come up to it later, but essentially what it means is we can manage your connection end-to-end on your ExpressRoute and hand it over as a layer 3 connection. We'll come back to that at a later stage during the webinar. And obviously one other thing to discuss is high availability. So you get multiple circuits, you get a strong redundancy. And before I move on, I think that another key one I want to sort of discuss scalability. Whereas let's say, before you start off with one site and you want to scale that to multiple sites, the complexity increases. With this, once you've set it up, it's quite easy to scale and have multiple sites included or multiple applications, departments. As long as you plan that in advance, then it's quite easy for you to add solutions to it pretty much on the fly without any sort of downtime. So with these key benefits discussed, let's have a look at a typical workflow and how the process of getting you from start to finish and setting up an ExpressRoute. Firstly, you need to set up an Azure subscription. So if you're already not an Azure consumer, then you simply go onto the portal and set up a login details. Once you've done that, then you need to order an ExpressRoute circuit. What that entails is you need to select your provider, your location, the billing model, etc. So once you've selected those steps, then you're provided with something known as S key, which is essentially a service key, and then so that's provided to your supplied to your provider. And what they use that for is to provision that circuit for yourself, and that S key is used to tag your traffic, so it's segregated from rest of their Azure consumers. Once they've done that, then you will see your portal. If you log into your portal, you will see your circuit status will change from provisioning to a provision state, and then finally at that point you are at the final stage of this, which is starting configuring the ExpressRoute itself and doing the routing on top, which I'll discuss in the next slide. So what do you need to set up the routing and set up the end-to-end connection? You need two logical connections per peering. So obviously this isn't, as I said earlier, this isn't a requirement. It is a requirement for you to have the SLA in place. You could get away with one connection, but it's our recommendation, and obviously if you go in with ExpressRoute, to have two logical connections so you get a valid SLA. If you don't have this, then there will be no SLA. Then there is one VLAN per peering. So this is only needed if you go with unmanaged service. I will discuss the unmanaged and managed when we come toward the end of the webinar. Then you need 2 times private and public subnet for your peerings. This is something used to connect you from your site all the way to Microsoft, and this is how they exchange the routing. Again, you need this if you are using an unmanaged service. With the managed service you provide, it will deal with this. Other things to consider is the BGP and also all your internal routing and route distribution once you get that information from Microsoft and you receive the routes. And a key one I think I want to sort of discuss here is your firewall rules. So with my experience, and the question most enterprises ask is, how do we start? What kind of policies we have in place? And I think my answer to that is, what's your policy? How would you see ExpressRoute? How do you see your Azure? Do you see it as an extension of your network? So depending on that, you could have quite a strict rule in place or quite a light rule, set of rules in place. And what I would recommend is, in our experience, is having a couple of light rules in place, so there is no restriction on data traveling back and forth. And as you develop and as you start migrating more of your infrastructure to Azure, then you can sort of lock that down and do it as you wish, really. So now that we've sort of discussed the requirement and pretty much all the routing, one thing I want to come back to is looking at the challenges we addressed earlier and how they addressed by using ExpressRoute. So if you recall, we talked about performance not being really predictable. With ExpressRoute, as we said, you have a predictable performance. It's a dedicated link set aside. HA was another thing to consider. So normally you do it on one of your firewalls, or you can have multiple firewalls and have some sort of monitoring set up, so if one fails, the other one picks up. With this, there's none of that. It's all in place. You have 2 logical connections there ready to take over if in case one of them fails. You can obviously you can also add VPN to that. So if both of your circuits were to fail, then you can have VPN as a backup. Scalability is another thing we discussed. So with this, once you've set it up, you can scale to as many sites as you need to without an issue. Speed, again, if you need to go anything above 1 gig, if you recall, we had a limitation of 1 gig, whereas with ExpressRoute, that limitation is gone. You can go all the way up to 10 gig. And then one thing I did mention at the beginning, I said people do normally think it's easy to start off with VPN and then move to ExpressRoute. So one thing I've normally come across is, when you start off with VPN, you need to create a gateway and you need to create your subscription, etc. By the time you do you move to ExpressRoute, you need to tear down all those settings and recreate it again. It can take a couple of hours, causes downtime, and a number of other issues. So I think if you plan this correctly in advance and maybe look at something like Cross Connect, which I'll come up to in a second, then you can avoid all that pretty much and have a connection up and running as quick as you could have on a VPN without the need to revisit this and re-architect your network. So let's have a look at some of the connectivity models I've sort of been speaking to for a little while. Now, if you look at this picture, you will see an end-to-end connection from your side all the way to Azure, and how Equinix plays a role in here, and sort of what services we offer. So there's two things, there's two ways you can connect to Equinix network, through us, and then connecting to Microsoft. That's using cross connect and point to point. So with cross connect, what that means, I think it's better if I explain it with an example. You have lots of big providers having presence inside the data center that Equinix is located at. So for instance, BT, Colt, Level 3, a number of other providers. So if if your provider is one of those listed here, and there are many more increasing on a daily basis, then you can simply contact them and ask for a cross connect, meaning they will connect from their cabinet to Equinix, and that would essentially give you an ExpressRoute. Once we've set that up, then you have ExpressRoute in place. The other method of connecting is point to point. So with the point to point, essentially you have a connection all the way directly from your site to Equinix data center, and from there you obviously get internet connection, so you get ExpressRoute connection. One thing I would mention is with the cross connect, you could utilize this if you have an MPLS network in place, or any sort of type of multiple WAN connection within your infrastructure, and probably it could be the quickest way of getting you up and running. So with this all discussed, I think one thing I want to sort of come back to, and what I've been sort of mentioning all along, is the type of connections you have, and that were layer 2 and layer 3. So with layer 2, or what we refer to as unmanaged, you essentially manage the connection end to end. So from your side all the way to Microsoft, you'll be dealing with the routing and BGP and exchange of data, dealing with sort of the SLAs and any problem with route redistributions, and other things in there, providing the VLANs and having the right equipment on site. With the layer 3 managed service, we sort of deal with that. So what we do is we sit in the middle between you and Microsoft, do all the routing between yourself and Microsoft, exchange all the routing and hand it over to yourself as almost, I think a good example is your existing internet connection. So we'll exchange all those routing and hand it over as a set of subnets. So that entails dealing with all the sort of SLAs and any sort of routing issues. So with all that discussed, I think that the final bit I want to cover here is some of the benefits of Equinix. We discussed the connectivity, so some of the benefits I wanted to bring up. There's plenty of capacity, so the lines aren't over provisioned. So if you purchase a certain speed, then you know that's been set aside for yourself. There is no internet hub. So if you connect from a cross connect or doing a point to point, there is no other sort of hub in place to get you to that data center. You pretty much have a direct connection all the way to Equinix. And something else to consider, and I think probably the last one I want to mention, is your SLA. So as well as having a Microsoft SLA, you also have the Equinix SLA on top, as well as your own provider. So you have SLA pretty much across the connection end to end. So with all that discussed, I think it's best if I hand it back over to Tony to discuss our offering and what we can do moving forward from here. So Tony, over to yourself.
Great, thank you ever so much, Aaron, for that. You covered a lot of ground there, so thank you for that. It's really good. So look, in terms of next steps, and just moving on from what you've just said there, if anyone is interested in what we've covered today, or what Aaron's covered today, and would like to explore in more detail what an ExpressRoute or cloud, in fact, implementation might look like within their organisations, we found that certainly in the past, that a useful way forward is to offer a no-charge structured workshop, where we have a look a little bit more closely around your requirements, your wider cloud context, and what we'll do is what we'd like to do is to conduct some more scenario modelling around ExpressRoute implementation and connectivity options, some of which Aaron has talked about today. So if you're interested, all you need to do is drop Charlie Laforet, Aram, or myself an email to indicate your interest. Our contact details are on the slide there. So give us a ring, and we'd be very happy to talk to you. So I think we're ready to draw things to a close today. Thanks again to Aram, Mo, Charlie, and of course the call attendees. Of course, we hope you found the webinar useful. Keep an eye on the Courageur website for future webinars and events coming up in the future, and we very much look forward to seeing, hearing from you in the future. So thank you very much for your time today.